Mr. Speaker, I am grateful for your indulgence to present this lengthy statement to this Honorable House this morning. It is an honor to rise today on behalf of the government in our last sitting of 2022 to provide an economic and fiscal update to this Honorable House and to the people of Bermuda. This statement will cover the latest report from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, the government's mid-year financial performance, and the government's pre-budget report tabled moments ago. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I laid for the information of this Honorable House the 2022 Bermuda Fiscal Responsibility Panel report, which I'll refer to as the report, which has been published on the Ministry of Finance section of the Bermuda Government Portal. The report represents the 8th annual report of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, which was established in 2015 as an international independent committee to review, monitor, assess, and publicly report on the progress of the Bermuda government. The panel is comprised of a team of international experts chaired by Jonathan Portes, a former government chief economist and UK Treasury official, and now a professor in economics and tax policy at King's College in London. The other members of the panel are Marion Bell, a former external member of the Market Policy Committee at the Bank of England, who also previously advised on fiscal matters to the government of Jersey, and Victoria Perry, a U.S. tax lawyer who recently retired from the International Monetary Fund, having spent many years providing technical advice to countries on tax policy and revenue administration. Mr. Speaker, the report contains a comprehensive analysis of Bermuda's fiscal and economic position, its strategy, and related actions. The panel provided their assessments, highlighted critical risks facing Bermuda, and provided recommendations for several key areas impacting Bermuda's fiscal and economic outlook. These include fiscal and tax strategy, expenditure policy, economic and fiscal developments, the international tax landscape, energy and climate change, the economic recovery plan, immigration, pensions, and health. Mr. Speaker, the panel endorsed key aspects of the government's fiscal and economic strategy, including the government's commitment to remain within its fiscal guardrails for the ratios of gross debt and net to GDP. The report commended the adoption of a target for a budget surplus of $50 million in 2026-2027, in line with their previous recommendation. However, as I'll cover later in my statement, identified challenges in reaching that goal. The panel also positively endorsed work being done with regard to the economic recovery plan, substantive tax reform, immigration reform, and climate change. The report also includes recommendations for consideration by the government. These include the following 2 recommendations concerning fiscal and tax strategy. Mr. Speaker, with regard to fiscal strategy, the report reiterates its recommendation that the government should plan for an annual budget surplus of at least $50 million for the 2026-27 fiscal year and subsequent years. This recommendation as the absolute minimum needed to make appreciable inroads into Bermuda's large external debt burden. The panel reiterates that further structural increase in revenues from taxation are required to ensure that the government achieves this target. Mr. Speaker, with regard to tax reform, the report stated, and I quote, "Since its inception, the panel has recommended fundamental reforms aimed at broadening the tax base, including increasing the progressivity of the tax system and increasing revenues, including individual capital income. The government intends to consult on a number of these issues in the pre-budget report, including revisiting some of the earlier recommendations from the Tax Reform Commission. The panel recommends the government commits in the next budget to legislating and implementing a set of reforms along the lines set out above." End quote. Mr. Speaker, the panel concluded its report by saying, and I quote, "The government is addressing many of the most serious problems facing the country, including issues raised in our previous report. The overall fiscal strategy set out in the 2022 budget is more coherent and credible than in prior budgets, but further action is required to deliver it. The fallout from the pandemic is largely behind now, though new global problems, inflation, fuel prices, and worsening climate change now face the country. The government has responded with an ambitious and challenging agenda: the Economic Recovery Plan, the Bermuda Health Plan, the Climate Task Force, an agenda to reform the pension system, and the recent Ministry of Economy and Labor report on demographic pressures. What is now required is implementation and delivery." End quotes. Mr. Speaker, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel plays an important role in fiscal policy making in Bermuda. It represents the only independent assessment of the government's fiscal strategy and plans and makes recommendations to ensure the government of Bermuda is progressing towards meeting its fiscal targets. The independent panel, which met with members of the government, opposition, trade unions, international business, and local business, delivered a broad endorsement of this government's fiscal and economic strategy. I take note of their call for delivery and implementation of the promised reforms, and this government will continue to tackle the difficult issues in a thoughtful fashion to ensure success for Bermuda's future. Mr. Speaker, I reiterate my appreciation to the members of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel for their detailed and comprehensive review of the government of Bermuda's financial position, and I urge all honorable members to take notes of their report and their recommendations as we debate issues later today and during next year's budget session. Mr. Speaker, I will now share with this honorable House the government's mid-year fiscal performance. Following the government's mid-year assessment, total revenue is revised upwards to $1.1 billion, approximately $30 million above initial estimates. This increase is primarily due to the continued economic recovery, with better than expected increases in tourism-related revenues, payroll tax, and stamp duty. This increase in revenue has more than offset the estimated $17.8 million loss in revenue from the aircraft register as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Mr. Speaker, total current account expenditures are now projected to be $956.8 million, $11.7 million above the 2022-2023 original estimate of $945.1 million. The projected increase is primarily driven by the government's economic relief package and other additional spending items which were announced earlier this year. As a result of the previous year's budget performance being better than expected, interest and guarantee management costs are projected to be $138.3 million, $10.5 million more than initially budgeted, largely as a result of one-time costs associated with the recent government debt refinancing. It is worth noting, with the latest transactions, the government has fully refinanced its near-term external debt, with more than 4 years until the next bond maturity in January 2027. This means that the government is largely protected from rising interest rates in the medium term, as there is not expected to be a need to borrow additional funds to finance government's ongoing operations. Mr. Speaker, capital account expenditures are projected to be $85 million, $12 million more than the $73 million originally budgeted. The projected increase is a result of the approved $7 million to fund critical refurbishments to Tynes Bay to ensure our local waste disposal facility is able to function, and a further $4.1 million to assist the Bermuda Housing Corporation in providing additional affordable housing for the people of Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the revised budget deficit for 2022-2023 is now projected to be $72 million, or $2 million, or 2.9% more than the original estimate of $70 million. This revised projection is expected to be achieved despite the significant economic relief package to assist persons dealing with the impact of rising global inflation, the elimination of duty for essential goods, the freezing of fuel prices at the pump to counter high energy costs resulting from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the additional investments in affordable housing and infrastructure, and the aforementioned one-time expenses due to the successful debt refinancing. When combining the revised deficit for this fiscal year and the expected deficit from the last fiscal year, the government's net debt is in a much better position than forecasted during February's budget presentation. Mr. Speaker, the March 31st, 2022 net debt level was $66 million lower than previously forecast in February's budget statement. In addition, as at March 31st, 2023, net debt is now forecasted to be $115 million lower than originally estimated in the budget statement projections. Yes, Mr. Speaker, that was not a misstatement, and I'll repeat it for honorable members opposite. The Bermuda government's net debt is now forecast to be $115 million lower than it was projected just 10 months ago. Mr. Speaker, time and time again, this government has demonstrated that it is a good steward of the public purse. Though the opposition may focus on a few missteps, I remind the public that no government gets it 100% right 100% of the time. Mr. Speaker, even Lionel Messi can miss a penalty every now and then. But I return to the weighty matters of finance. Time and time again, this government has demonstrated that we can be trusted to be good stewards of the public purse. We have delivered relief to Bermudians who are challenged with the highest global inflation seen in 40 years. We have made investments in affordable housing and critical infrastructure. We have successfully refinanced our debt despite challenging market conditions, and we are meeting our budget targets. Our mid-year performance sets a strong foundation as we approach next year's budget. Mr. Speaker, when we return to this Honorable House next year, it will be for our budget session. One of the key steps in the budget process is the publishing of a pre-budget report. Earlier today, I tabled the 2022 pre-budget report on behalf of the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Speaker, as honorable members will be aware, a pre-budget report outlines the priorities for the next budget in a medium-term framework covering external developments and internal strategies. The government should be accountable for developing strategies to cope with both domestic and international turbulence, and the strategies contemplated should be transparent and open to feedback. Mr. Speaker, in the pre-budget report, we have laid out the government's economic and fiscal policy challenges and provided fiscal policy options for public consultation while soliciting feedback from those affected by any policy changes under consideration. Like most states and territories, Bermuda's economy is vulnerable to external events, underlining the need for fiscal and financial prudence. This vulnerability is compounded by Bermuda's continuing budget deficits and high level of government net debt, standing at $3.1 billion. Mr. Speaker, accordingly, this government must take appropriate action to address the problems the island faces. It is also important that stakeholders and citizens understand these challenges and are aware of the factors influencing the government's fiscal policy decisions, and utilize the opportunity to give their views. This will facilitate the achievement for the best outcome for Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, this government has already committed to the development and implementation of robust and prudent fiscal and economic strategy based on the fundamental principles of sound fiscal management. These principles include prudent management of financial risks, fiscal policies that enhance the government's fiscal position and are consistent with a reasonable degree of stability and predictability, policy decisions which are constructive, maintain the integrity of the tax system, and have a positive impact on future generations. Mr. Speaker, actions taken in this regard have already had a positive impact on Bermuda's economic and fiscal position, as previously highlighted. Our program has been positively assessed by key credit ratings agencies, with Bermuda's debt being given solid credit ratings and its economic outlook being determined to be stable. The Fiscal Responsibility Panel has also commented favorably on many of the critical initiatives that the government is undertaking to address identified challenges and prepare for the future. The government remains committed to continuing strategic implementation of a well-considered and sound fiscal and economic plan. Mr. Speaker, the key factors which therefore must be considered in the framing and composition of the 2023-2024 budget are as follows. The government's 2022 general election campaign platform and the 2022 throne speech to ensure that the commitments made are appropriately met. Relevant economic considerations, whether globally in relation to our major trading partners or the economic realities that exist within the Bermuda context. Taxation sensitivities. Recognizing that international business is a key contributor to tax revenue, consideration has to be given to the potential competitive impact of decisions being made on this sector. The need for continued fiscal discipline to further reduce deficits on the path towards a balanced budget in fiscal year 2024, 2025, and ultimate reduction in debt levels. The requirements for continued investment and support for the initiatives within Bermuda's economic recovery plan. Continued effective use of zero-based budgeting and the use of the public value assessment outputs to enhance efficiency and cost-effective utilization of resources. The appropriate evaluation of the highlighted risk and implementation of the recommendations from the 2022 report of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, whose role and work have already been addressed in this statement. In this regard, consideration will also be given to the recommendations made by the 2018 Tax Reform Commission. And finally, Mr. Speaker, feedback from the pre-budget report consultation. Mr. Speaker, before providing a brief outline of key proposals for tax reform contained in the pre-budget report, I think it would be appropriate to highlight certain key economic considerations which are relevant in the Bermuda context. In particular, I would note that global growth is projected to remain unchanged at 3.2% in 2022 and to decline to 2.7% in 2023. This is the weakest growth profile since 2001, with the exception of the global financial crisis and the recent COVID-19 pandemic. The main factors affecting the economy include Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the highest global inflation in 40 years, the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic slowdown in China. The U.S. economy has been affected less than most countries by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but is being particularly impacted by surging levels of inflation and tightening fiscal and monetary conditions, which are expected to continue to slow spending across the economy. Real GDP in the United States is anticipated to grow by 1.8% in 2022, 0.5% in 2023, and 1% in 2024. Notwithstanding the positive steps being taken to stimulate growth in the Bermuda economy, as the United States is Bermuda's largest trading partner and the source of most visitors to the island, the United States' economic performance will impact the pace of Bermuda's economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, having given considerations to all the factors noted above, specific key proposals are presented for consideration and feedback in the pre-budget report. Mr. Speaker, these include changes to the payroll tax framework in relation to both employer and employee tax rates. The proposals for changes to employee taxes include changes to rates to reduce payroll taxes for lower and middle income workers. It is proposed to exempt the first $48,000 of labor income for all workers from payroll tax. This proposed change will remove 30% of the workforce from being liable for paying payroll tax while providing relief to those workers who are most affected by reduced purchasing power due to high global inflation. To compensate for lost revenue, the next three tax bands proposed to be adjusted upwards. The results of these proposed rates will see all persons earning under $105,000 annually paying less in payroll taxes compared to the prior year. Mr. Speaker, the pre-budget report also proposed a reduction of employer payroll tax for small and medium-sized businesses with payrolls under $1 million, reductions for hotels, restaurants, and retail stores. Further, the pre-budget report proposes the elimination of employer payroll tax for farmers, fishermen, educational, sport and science institutions, and small businesses with an annual payroll of less than $200,000. Mr. Speaker, additionally, in a sensitive and considered way, proposals have been made for limited increases in taxation, which can have a meaningful positive impact on revenues without compromising Bermuda's competitive position or materially reducing spending and investment. It has been highlighted in the report that government does not intend to continue with the extension of pandemic-related payroll tax concessions, which were put in place to assist business during the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, we've also appropriately taken into account the recommendations of the 2018 Tax Reform Commission, with new withholding taxes being proposed on managed services and dividends for local companies. In addition, amendments to the framework for company fees are included for consideration. The report also includes a number of proposals that have been suggested by key business and union stakeholders in the Bermuda community. Mr. Speaker, the pre-budget report is an important document that promotes transparency in the budget process, reinforces accountability, and allows for effective collaboration on matters that will have a significant impact on individuals and businesses in the community. It is hoped that feedback will be provided to strengthen and undergird the robust approach this government takes to economic, fiscal, and financial management. Mr. Speaker, as we have stated on many occasions, this government is committed to taking care of its people while ensuring its fiscal and economic policies contribute to sustained growth and stability. Our track record has been positively assessed, and we remain committed to a path that will ensure a bright future for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.